In fact, the Justice Department says it will only file an appeal to Monday's ruling by a Florida judge, which lifted mask requirements at airports and train stations. So if the CDC still considers COVID a public health risk, there's a lot of back and forth here, creating a whole lot of confusion, right, for commuters in our area. Take a listen.
A little bit like a taste of normal, and it was a lot more comfortable and a lot more pleasant.
It's just really confusing. So it's just like this patchwork of different rules and enforcement of it, and there's no uniformity.
All right, so follow me on this one. Masks are required on New York City subways as well as Metro North, LIRR, PATH trains, Greyhound buses, ferries, as well as Uber and Lyft within the city. However, outside the city, New Jersey Transit, Amtrak, New York Waterway, and rideshare companies are making masks optional. So the legal implications of Monday's ruling can have far-reaching effects. And here to share her insight with us this morning is attorney Rachel Demarest Gold. Hopefully you can kind of clear a little bit of this up for us. Good morning, Rachel. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you, too. There really is so much confusion among New Yorkers right now because there's been an increase in COVID cases across the state. So does Monday's ruling basically nullify the state's authority to require masks on public transportation?
Oh, by no stretch of the imagination. No, that was a very specific decision that basically spoke to the power of the CDC and the federal regulations that were promulgated. The states still have the power. In fact, one of the things the decision said, although I don't necessarily agree with it, but it said that public health enforcement was traditionally a state obligation and a state power. And as a result, it was one of the grounds the judge used to strike the standing mandate.
So I guess the question here becomes, why is the Justice Department waiting on the CDC to decide whether or not to appeal that decision, right? The CDC said they needed some time to gather information, but what would happen if they didn't wait for the CDC?
Well, I mean, I think that what they want to do is decide whether or not, from a precedent perspective, they have a strong enough case to want whatever the next judge is going to say about this. They want to be, one of the things that the judge said was that there wasn't enough information in the CDC's justification for the way it went about imposing these regulations. I do think, though, last night the Biden administration announced it's going to appeal. So I think they've made that decision. Right.
Now, this all came down when some people were either mid-travel, maybe in the air. We saw passengers on planes cheering when they were informed of the ruling. I mean, it was mid-flight. Right. So But could the airlines actually face potential lawsuits from passengers who may have, let's say, weakened immune systems? Then they change this mask mandate while they're in the middle of the air.
That's a great question. I mentioned last time that we spoke that from an employment perspective, there's certainly still a possibility for lawsuits. I think that if a federally regulated airline releases its mandate, and as a result, this transmission, they're probably protected. That doesn't mean there won't be lawsuits to defend. It doesn't mean that the law might not change as it's developing. But they have a lot of cover based upon the federal regulation and the judge's decision.
So I guess for a lot of questions I heard yesterday from some folks were, okay, so there was this federal mandate, right? So and now it's lifted. So how can states still, like New York, say, okay, you have to wear it on the subway? Can you kind of explain the legality of why you can still wear it in some places, even though it was lifted federally?
Yeah, sure. So the feds really have limited jurisdiction to the extent that they deal with matters that deal with interstate commerce, right, with certain things that are federally regulated by statute, by powers delegated by Congress. And it's really quite narrow. I mean, that was the basis for the Constitution and the fact that we have a system of a federal government with state powers. So states continue to retain all of their powers, and that includes, for the most part, criminal enforcement, which is something that is traditionally a state power. And then we're talking about, when you're talking about the MTA, when you're talking about Uber or Lyft, you're talking about things that are both state and locally regulated. Okay. And the states and localities absolutely maintain those powers.
So I have a question for you. We're talking about those lawsuits that people could file. No, so the CDC's mask mandate, though, was set to expire in a couple of weeks. So what's the likelihood that any of those lawsuits, will even have any legs, or will they just be a waste of time?
Well, the fact that it was set to expire doesn't mean that it was going to expire, right? It's been extended several times, and I believe the feds had the power that they exercised. I understand that the state of the law doesn't agree with me at the moment. But I think that's the answer.
What's the timeline here, right? So, I mean, it's okay, your light just flickering. So what's the likelihood here, if the appeal goes through, that people then wouldn't have to wear masks again? Kind of walk us through a timeline here of what that looks like.
Sure. Well, what happens is that the feds will probably not just file an appeal, but will also file with that a motion for an injunction to say this should be something that is in effect immediately because it's urgent and has urgent implications, and they're likely to succeed on the merits. Were that to happen and the order were to be issued by a judge, then that's something that immediately they could re-implement the mask mandate on those regulated entities.
Right.
So really, I mean, how long could it take for there to be a final decision, or is that really never something could actually happen?
Well, it could actually happen, but it won't happen at this level because this was a district court judge. This wasn't even an appellate court judge, right? So this case now will go to the circuit court, which will rule on an appeal now that the federal government's decided to appeal it. And then it can go to the Supreme Court. It's a federal question. It's a federal statute. It has a slew of constitutional implications in terms of interstate commerce and some of the bases that the judge used for her decision. So it can go on a long time. There certainly should be an expedited track based upon the urgency and the emergence of what we're dealing with. But were this to just take the track of any other lawsuit because they want to change the precedent or they want to get to some answer despite what's going on in reality, I mean, that can take quite a long time.
Yeah, time will tell. Yeah, certainly. And advice, just carry it with you, right? Because in some places you need it, in some places you don't. Attorney Rachel Demarest Gold, good to have you here. Thanks for kind of navigating these confusing waters for us.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good day.